Alrighty guys, welcome to another video. Today I'm going to go over Joe Rogan's podcast episode with Chris Kresser where they debunk the Game Changers. And speaking of which, the Game Changers has been debunked so many times. Everyone's talking about it, which is great. I mean, I'm really excited that so many people are talking about this documentary. So many people are watching it. Though I do identify myself with veganism, first and foremost, I identify myself with the truth. And if the truth goes against veganism, then I just have to take a step back and admit that, hey, what I thought was right turned out to be wrong, and just admit, that we have better information, better science. But in order to do that, we have to look at the facts, we have to look at the information. Joe Rogan and Chris Kresser both have a reputation of being relatively biased when it comes to veganism and diet in general when it comes to meat. But anyways, enough blibber blabber, let's get straight onto the video. First of all, they do start off by saying the right things, like, we don't have anything against veganism, and we actually like James Wilkes, the producer, etc., etc. But you can see from a very early point in the podcast, they do start making it seem as if the documentary is very disingenuous. They set the frame of it being dishonest.
Do you think that they're making these films because they believe what they're saying, or do you think they're making these films because they are trying to convert people to being vegan, and they think that distorting reality and just bending things and cherry picking data is acceptable because the long run, the benefits of getting the world to shift over to a vegan diet is worth not being completely objective or honest about the actual facts?
So one of the very first things that they do is go and discredit the whole gladiator scene.
Packing in the carbs also packed on the pounds. Gladiators needed subcutaneous fat. A fat cushion protects you from cut wounds and shields nerves and blood vessels in a fight. So they were basically fattening them up so they could survive longer in the arena.
I find this a little bit interesting because so many of the debunkings of the Game Changers actually have really focused a lot on this whole gladiator thing. And it's a bit strange because this was really just James's personal experience and his story of how he found it curious that these gladiators were mostly vegetarian, and how it was a bit strange that prize fighters like them could do well. Whether or not they were prize fighters, that a lot of people saying, oh, they were slaves, they were fed the worst diet, they were fat. I used to think they were prize fighters just from my experience with looking at gladiators. Maybe I've just been brainwashed by Russell Crowe. But the point is that this was just James's personal story of how he became curious and what made him think more about plant-based eating in terms of athletics and people who are doing a lot of strenuous sports. It's not really like the whole argument of the movie hangs on this gladiator scene. Another thing I really liked that they were talking about was when Chris Kresser was talking about being evidence-based, putting all the citations on his website for debunking the Game Changers. And as you guys know, I am a medical doctor, and so I am a big fan of being evidence-based. However, disappointingly, when you go on Chris Kresser's website, it's actually very, very much opinions, articles. The one for showing that the gladiators were fat was just a website with the opinion of another person, so that really doesn't constitute any high quality evidence. And then again, talking about how the movie is so dishonest and they're trying to manipulate us and so misleading. They talk about the peanut butter sandwich and the eggs. I mean, I've seen this in a lot of other posts, but again, just fact checking, and it turns out it's about the same amount of protein. And then they talk about how misleading it is to talk about protein in the same way because it's the bioavailability is different, the profile is different. They talk about the DIAS and this IAAO and how the scores are completely different, and we had peanut butter being 0.2 or 0.4 while eggs and meat were like 1.4. Makes it sound so much superior, right, to the plant-based proteins. Now, for someone who's talking about the movie being so misleading, I found this to be relatively misleading of them, because when it comes to this IAAO amino acid theory, it basically goes by saying if one indispensable amino acid is low, then all the other amino acids will also be oxidized. So in other words, if one essential amino acid is low, it will limit all the other amino acids down to the level of that one amino acid. But this ignores the fact that the human body can pull together amino acids from different sources, and different sources of food have different amino acid profiles. So as long as you're not eating just one single source of food all day, then you should never really run into this problem.
And when they're talking about the USRDA, they're talking about like how much the United States recommended daily allowances. Isn't that just to be healthy? Like to be alive?
Not even healthy, but to be alive is more accurate.
Okay, so here they claim that the RDA is just basically so that you don't die. It's just to stay alive. Well, actually, I'll read you the definition of the RDA. The daily intake level of a nutrient considered sufficient by the Food and Nutrition Board of the Institute of Medicine to meet the requirements of 97.5% of healthy individuals in each life stage and sex group. Again, perhaps this could be seen as a little bit misleading.
And so especially the people that are already convinced, for them it's like, excellent, I knew Jesus was real, now I've got the proof. It's really like that. It becomes, the ideology becomes so strong, it becomes like a religion.
Okay, so I've heard this as well. Let's just get this straight right away. So veganism is an evidence-based stance. It's a factual stance based on how industries use and exploit animals, and then taking steps in order to minimize the contribution that we are making to that unnecessary suffering. Religion, on the other hand, is a belief in a superhuman order. As you can see, it's a completely different concept. Amen to that. Then they start mentioning Joel Kahn, giving him a few jabs.
I had him on to try to pursue this path of objectivity, to try to give him an opportunity to express what's incorrect about what you're saying, and it didn't work out for him. And by everybody's account that I saw, that he lost that debate.
When I watched the Joel Kahn debate with Chris Kresser and Joe Rogan, it was my impression that Joel Kahn was much more composed, and it gave the impression as if he was the reasonable adult trying to maneuver through the defensive arguments of two very emotional people. But hey, then again, maybe I was the biased one here.
There have been studies that show that particularly monocropping type of plant agriculture kills far more animals than are killed from eating cows, for example.
And this argument I've heard so much recently. I don't know who it is that came up, and everybody's just using this argument again and again and again, but it's just making a fact, essentially. When you look at the numbers, there's not even a comparison. It's so crystal clear. And Joe Rogan even questions him on this and tries to get a little bit of the other perspective in and try to make it a little more balanced. And you can see he's a bit more open-minded than Chris Kresser in this aspect. But Chris Kresser is just argument. Another point that I think a lot of people miss is this whole idea of grasslands being this natural thing that, we just need to leave the grass as it is so cows can go and eat. People don't realize grasslands are not natural. In most areas in the world, there would not be any grasslands if it weren't man-made. This would grow into forest. If we allowed wildlife and nature to take its course, all of these grasslands would become forest. So again, this idea that having grass everywhere is supernatural is quite irrational, quite illogical as well. But anyways, he flat out denies what Joe Rogan is saying, says it's wrong, it's false, and doesn't back up any of that with any evidence once again, making the argument that industrial farming will cause the same amount of damage, whether it be vegan or plant-based industrial farming, or whether it be animal agriculture related, and that it will cause the same amount of deaths. And Chris Kresser even disproves himself.
Up to 7.3 billion animals killed every year from plant agriculture, if you count birds killed by pesticides, fish deaths from fertilizer runoff, plus reptiles and amphibians poisonings from eating toxic insects from the pesticides.
What's the number?
7.3 billion animals killed every year through plant agriculture.
In terms of life, there's far more life taken by plant agriculture than there is life taken by animal agriculture, even factory farming.
Oh, yeah.
You forgot to do the math, man. How many animals do you think die per year because of animal agriculture? How many animals do you think we are killing each year for food? Well, usually the estimates are around 70 to 80 billion. And if you include animals from the ocean into this calculation, then we're talking trillions rather than billions. You should have brought your calculator there, buddy.
They were talking about the greenhouse gases from meat, and it's just a fake number. I mean, it's over the top. It's over the top, not true.
Yeah.
The specific number is 9% for all agriculture, including growing crops. The vast majority of all of our greenhouse gas issues are coming from transportation and from industry. This is undisputable.
So this is where I wonder too about whether are they not aware of what's happening here, or is it disingenuous?
Again, more of this conspiracy theory mentality that, vegans have this evil agenda of lying to everyone, even though we have the biggest organizations such as the FAO backing us, that actually when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, animal agriculture is responsible for even more greenhouse gas emissions than the entire transport industry combined.
Well, what's going on is what you see in a lot of these videos where only one person gets to talk.
Yeah.
Right? One person who has a specific agenda gets to cherry pick the data and distort it.
kind of like on this show.
I mean, and you can accuse us of doing that right now because both of us are clearly on the same page.
Yeah.
And I would be happy to have James come in with you afterwards.
Yeah.
But we decided
We did it with Joel.
Yes, and we did. Well, James is way more reasonable than Joel, and not slimy.
I would love to see that episode. I hope it happens.
When it's all said and done, I would just like people to be informed. And everyone is going to have their own ideological bias. Everyone's going to have their own preference. But to make poorly informed decisions, or that's being kind. To be more blunt, deceptive information forming your decisions, and having health consequences because of that, to me, pisses me off and freaks me out.
Yeah.
Because it's not the health aspects are not being represented accurately.
Look, I completely agree with this point of view. I completely agree with exactly what you just said, but where is any of the evidence that this is going on with this documentary?
It particularly bothers me when kids are involved.
Oh, there was a case recently where I was going to tweet it, but I was like, God damn it, I can't even tweet it. It's so sad. Where a child had died from malnutrition.
Yeah. Because
the parents were feeding it a vegan diet, and all the other kids looked like they were starving to death too. And then the social workers came in, and it's a goddamn nightmare.
This is really appealing to our emotions, right? Babies, like we don't want to be harming babies. But again, where is any of the evidence? They criticized anecdotal evidence at the beginning of the podcast, but again and again and again, they're just using anecdotes one after the other. And a ton of babies die of malnutrition who aren't vegan. Yet, we're not being objective here.
The FAO has said we only have about 60 harvests left if soil continues to degrade at the rate that it's going. And so one of the arguments for regenerative, holistically managed livestock is that can actually help regenerate healthy soils. And some, like Joel Salatin or Alan Savory, would argue that that's the only way we're going to be able to feed the world, because only about 60% of available land is not suitable for cropping. Even if we decided, hey, let's just plant soy and corn and plant plants everywhere, we couldn't, because it's too rocky or hilly, or the soil's not adequate to do that. But it could be used for livestock. Again,
this is another statement which is factually incorrect. There are examples of people who have sustainably farmed over long periods of time. So it's a sustainability question. It's the farming practices rather than just having some animals that magically make the soil healthier. For example, the Hunsons, they have had farming systems for thousands of years, and their soil quality remains the same. The idea that some parts of the world are unsuited for any crops being grown there is again unrealistic, because in today's modern age, with the technology we have today with salination plants and irrigation systems and greenhouses, there's no such thing as an area of land where you could not grow plants for food. Okay, so we're already 35 minutes into this podcast, and just from fact checking all the claims that they are making so far, I really don't see how you can make out the Game Changers to be a dishonest documentary. But the last thing I would like to mention is that Chris really shoots himself in the foot when he then makes the big claim, and he states that there's this big study, the biggest study so far, that has looked at consumption of meat and disease, and came with a conclusion that we should not be reducing our meat or processed meat intake. And this just really proves that Chris Kresser doesn't actually read the studies that he uses to back himself up. He probably just goes to the conclusion and says, oh, you will be hard pressed to find evidence, and just uses that. But if you take a look at the actual study, which came from NutriRex, by the way, which is also known for making misleading science, for example, the one leading to the Time magazine Butter is Back. But anyways, when you look at the actual results of the study that he uses to back himself up, the findings were that the intake of meat was linked to an increased rate of heart disease, type 2 diabetes, colorectal cancer, breast cancer. Does any of this surprise you? Do you really think that Chris Kresser went through every single one of those studies in detail before putting them up as evidence? Of course not. He is like one of these internet warriors that just throws around studies, trying to scare away people by just finding anything that remotely supports his view, and then just putting it up as evidence to make himself look stronger. Who's being deceptive now?
The only guy for this job.
I'm running like 7.5 combined hours on this.
7.5 combined hours.
Is there anything in this movie that they got right? to end it on a positive note.
And this is another example, by the way, of how Joe Rogan seemed to be actually making an effort to be a little bit less biased and take a little bit of the other perspective, which I do appreciate. However, this is basically the last nail in the coffin for Chris Kresser in terms of his irrationality and complete unobjectivity around this subject, because when it comes to giving an alternative to veganism for sustainability, he hinges his entire argument on this negative carbon sequestering, which claims to have negative emissions while producing beef.
I agree with them on the problem. Like, I think feedlot, CAFO, beef and livestock production is not the way to go.
Right.
I think it can be environmentally destructive. It's just where they went with the solution is not where I go. They go to plant-based vegan diet. I go to regenerative, holistically managed livestock,
And this is how they propose to be doing it. I quote, "The land is allowed to rest for an optimal amount of time before the grazing animals are allowed to return to that spot." Science.
rather than just having the cattle stay in the same place the whole time, like in a feedlot. They're moving the cattle around. The cattle are pooping. Then they bring the chickens to where that was, where the cattle were, and they move it around in a way, again, that I don't fully understand. But the effect of this is that the amount of carbon that is sequestered from the atmosphere is greater than the amount of CO2 that is emitted.
Letting the animals walk around a little bit before they come back to the same spot, and it magically just makes the carbon emissions go to the negative. And Chris Kresser actually admitted not to understand the concept of behind how this negative carbon system works. Yet you're going to hinge your entire argument on something you don't understand. I mean, come on. I mean, you can't do that. That's just, I don't know how anyone can take your stance seriously anymore. That just completely loses credibility when your argument hinges on something you don't understand. And when it comes to the whole deceptiveness and telling people the truth and allowing people to be informed, I agree with all of those things. That we have the same position on a lot of things. And just like they said in the beginning of their podcast, I don't believe they're bad people. I think they truly believe in what they preach, and they're actually trying to help. However, I think they're so emotional, so irrational around these topics that the facts, which are not on their side, just go completely over their heads, and most people don't have the desire or knowledge to fact check them, which unfortunately results in a lot of people just taking this face value, becoming scared, and allowing this to keep them away from trying veganism. In order to try to bring some clarity, I'm going to share with you some of the ways that I try to filter out the noise and really get down to what is true. So number one thing that you have to do is look at the entirety of the evidence. You have to look at everything. You have to read as much about the topic as possible and about both sides of both perspectives, both viewpoints, and then just look at the totality of it, right? It's like what we talked about before. You have to look for the truth and then make up your opinion, rather than make up your opinion and then find things that confirm it. Second thing to do is then to look at the biggest organizations of professionals whose job it is to look at these hundreds of studies on the same topics and put them together, look at the statistical analysis, and actually make real logical conclusions about them, because obviously most people don't have the time or the skills to go over these hundreds of things. And again, we need to look at the best available information we have and not fall for these emotional arguments such as the baby argument that they have. I mean, I personally, my nephew Noah, he has been vegan since birth, and he is the healthiest baby you've ever seen. And again, this is anecdotal evidence, but when you look at the actual evidence, the actual big organizations such as the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, the Dietitians of Canada, the British Nutrition Foundation, even the organizations in Norway, they are all saying that plant-based diets are adequate for people of all stages of life and do have benefits for reducing the risk of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, breast, prostate, colorectal cancer, and obesity. And then third is just to look at this from a psychological point of view. Like who is more likely to have your best interest at heart? Who is more likely to be biased here? Someone who has had the same view since birth, has always loved meat, and then now is looking for studies to confirm their previously formed beliefs, or someone who used to eat meat, like most vegans, so someone who used to eat animal products, then looked at the facts objectively and changed their mind. In order to make a big change like that, you already have to have a certain degree of open-mindedness. So just consider, which one do you think is most likely to be biased to the point of not looking at things objectively? So yeah, as I was saying, unfortunately this is going to be very confusing for a lot of people. However, Try your best not to fall into the temptation of blaming and judging and getting angry, as this tends to only slow things down, and we want people to open up to the truth as soon as possible. Now, as you guys can see, it's become night here. I've been here for a very long time talking about this podcast. It's getting really dark. It's getting really cold. So I'm going to end it there. I really do hope to get James Wilkes on their podcast to talk, though. That would be a really good show. It would be a really good episode, so I hope they do that. But anyways, I'm going to go inside and warm myself. Thank you so much for watching. Do let me know what you think in the comment section. Do you think they were objective? Do you think they looked a little bit biased? Let me know if you agree with the things that we went through on this video. And like always, I'll thank you for watching. I think I already said that, but I'll thank you again because gratefulness is important. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I'll see you very soon.
What else?
Let's see. God, there's so much.
I just don't know how anyone's going to refute this. Like I said, I really like James a lot. But if he decides to come back and come and sit with you after hearing this and watching this, I don't know what he could say.